She had him removed from the hospital board meeting in front of 11 trustees, 2 department heads, and a wall of windows overlooking the city's oldest pediatric wing. Cassandra Holt did it the way she did most things, efficiently, without cruelty, without asking his name first. He was wearing paint-stained work boots and carrying a paper cup of coffee from the vending machine on the second floor, the one that cost 75 cents and tasted like warm cardboard. He smiled when the security guard touched his elbow. That should have been the first thing she noticed. It wasn't. 41 minutes later, her phone rang. The $3.2 million donation to the Children's Oncology Wing, the one that would have funded 4 years of research and saved the Capitol campaign, was gone. And the man in the work boots was the one who had it. The morning had started the way the worst ones always do. Quietly. Dressed up to look like something ordinary. Cassandra Holt woke at 5:52 to an alarm she didn't need because she hadn't really slept. She lay in the dark of her apartment 12 floors above the street, listening to the city outside do its early morning calculations. The garbage trucks, a siren, the specific hush of a Tuesday that had decided to be cold. She was the executive director of Hartwell Children's Medical Center. She'd taken the role 3 years ago at 34, the youngest director in the hospital's 90-year history, handed the position in the middle of a funding crisis that the board had spent 6 months pretending wasn't happening. She'd made hard decisions in those 3 years. She'd reorganized 2 departments, renegotiated 3 major contracts, and sat across from people who had more institutional history than she had years on Earth and told them plainly that things were going to change. She'd been right. The hospital was better for it. But better wasn't the same as saved, and the Capitol campaign for the oncology wing had been running for 2 years on optimism and half measures. Today was supposed to end all of that. She got up and made coffee in the kitchen, the old-fashioned way, on the stove, while the sun was still deciding whether to commit. She stood at the window while it brewed and looked at the city below and said the number quietly to herself. 3.2 million. She'd said it enough times in the past month that it had started to feel like a sentence handed down. Her development director, Marcus, steady, meticulous, always the last person to leave on a Friday, had laid it out clearly in October. Without a major gift commitment by end of quarter, the oncology wing renovation would be pushed back 18 months, minimum. The kids already on the waiting list would stay there. The phrase waiting list had a particular weight in a children's hospital. It was not abstract. The Aldrin gift was supposed to end that. The donor, according to every piece of research Marcus had compiled, was a man named Thomas Aldrin. He wasn't in any charity gala photographs. He didn't have a foundation named after himself or a building with his name on it. What he had was a reputation that moved through the philanthropic world the way certain things moved, quietly, by word of mouth, in the spaces between conversations. The people who knew him said he was careful, exacting, and completely serious about where his money went. Cassandra had prepared for 3 weeks. She'd reviewed the wing's case study until she could recite it backward. She'd done a dry-run presentation with Marcus and her communications director and her head of pediatric oncology. She'd chosen the boardroom on the 4th floor because it overlooked the courtyard garden the children's families used, because she wanted Thomas Aldrin to be able to see, literally see, what his investment would protect. She was ready. She needed this to be over. By the time she reached the hospital, she had checked her messages twice, answered a call from the board chair about parking arrangements, and told the front desk in a tone she recognized as the director voice, the one she'd built to keep things moving, that everything needed to be perfect. "Of course," said the desk coordinator, with the patience of someone who'd been told this many times. "We'll handle it." Hartwell Children's Medical Center occupied an entire city block. The lobby had a mural on the north wall that a local artist had painted a decade ago, full of color and movement, children running towards something out of frame. Cassandra had always liked it. She passed it now without stopping and took the elevator to 4. Her assistant, June, 26, sharp-eyed, who had been with Cassandra since her 2nd week in the role and showed no signs of leaving, was already at her station outside the conference room. She looked up when Cassandra came in. "Good morning. You've got 40 minutes before they arrive. The catering is set up. There's a parking issue with one of the board members. Philip's handling it, and the projector cable is the wrong type." Cassandra set her bag down. "Which projector?" "The main one." Marcus brought a backup. "Good." Also, June's expression shifted just slightly. "The donor liaison from Aldrin's office called this morning. She said Mr. Aldrin sometimes attends initial meetings without advance introduction. She wanted us to be aware." Cassandra looked at her. "What does that mean specifically?" "It means he might walk in without being on any list." June's voice was carefully neutral. She said it was just his way of getting a feel for an organization before the formal meeting. Cassandra thought about this for 3 seconds. Then she said, "Make sure the front desk has that information. Anyone who comes in for the 10 o'clock should be treated as a confirmed guest. I'll call them now." She should have walked to the front desk herself. She would think about this later, in the specific way you think about the 10 seconds that changed the shape of an entire day. Not with rage, which would have been easier, but with the cold clarity of someone taking inventory. She didn't walk to the front desk. She went to the conference room instead, because the presentation was in 40 minutes and there were still details to settle. The boardroom on 4 was the best room in the building, floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides, a long oval table in pale wood, and directly below, visible through the window, the courtyard garden with its stone benches and its autumn bare trees, and even now at 9:15, a woman sitting with a child in a knit hat in her lap. A mother, a daughter, maybe 8 or 9 years old, bald from treatment, leaning against the woman's shoulder. Cassandra had learned, in 3 years, not to let herself look too long. You had to look long enough to remember why the work mattered, and not so long that it took you somewhere you couldn't come back from during a meeting. The room filled slowly. Board members, her medical director, 2 members of the development team, the head of pediatric oncology, the board chair, a man named Gerald Ashworth, 62, silver-haired, who wore his seniority like a comfortable coat and had a particular talent for making every suggestion sound like it had already been agreed to, arrived at 9:55 and settled into his seat at the far end of the table from Cassandra with the ease of a man who'd been settling into rooms like this for 30 years. Aldrin's team was expected at 10 sharp. At 9:57, the door opened. Cassandra was reviewing the first slide with Marcus when she became aware of the shift in the room. It was subtle, a recalibration, the slight change in ambient attention that happened when something unexpected entered a space. She turned. A man was standing near the door. He was maybe 40, she guessed, medium height. He wore dark jeans and a canvas work jacket that had seen better days. His boots, she noticed, had dried paint on the toe. He was holding a paper cup from the vending machine on 2. She knew it by the cup's color, the particular institutional beige, and he was looking at the courtyard below through the glass with an expression of quiet interest. One of the junior coordinators, a young man named Brett, who had been on the team for 6 weeks and had the particular eagerness of someone still learning which battles to pick, appeared at the man's side. "Excuse me, sir, can I help you?" The man turned. He had calm eyes and an unhurried face. "I'm here for the 10 o'clock, he said. His voice was even and quiet. "Do you have a guest confirmation? Badge?" "No badge." Brett straightened. "Then I'm going to need you to wait in the lobby until..." Cassandra had crossed half the room by then, moving to manage the delay, not because she thought the man was a threat, but because she needed the 10 o'clock to start on the 10 o'clock, and she didn't have room in her head for anything else. She looked at him the way she looked at things that needed to be resolved quickly and said, "I'm sorry, this meeting is for confirmed attendees only. If you're with the Aldrin group, we just need someone from their office too." She didn't finish the sentence. Something about the way he looked at her. Not unkind. Not offended. Something more measured, more considered. The look of a man who had just watched something confirm itself. "Of course," he said, and he went. She turned back to the room. The time was 9:59. The presentation was ready. She had work to do. The donor liaison from Aldrin's office arrived at 10:02. A woman named Harriet, composed and professional, who took her seat and said nothing about Thomas Aldrin's absence. Nobody mentioned the chair at the corner of the table that remained empty. That was the thing about rooms like this one. The thing that was missing didn't get named directly. Everyone simply arranged themselves around it and talked about other things. Cassandra presented. She was good at this. She'd been doing it long enough to run on a kind of practiced fluency while part of her brain tracked the room, the board members' faces, the way Harriet from the Aldrin office nodded at the financial projections, the particular angle of afternoon light coming through the glass. She made the case for the wing. She walked through the patient data. She answered every question clearly. Thomas Aldrin's empty chair sat in the periphery of her vision and did not move. At 10:43, her phone buzzed under the table. At 10:45, June appeared at the door and caught her eye with a look that had only one meaning. Cassandra wrapped the presentation, offered closing remarks she'd rehearsed enough that her voice stayed even, and called a break. She was in the hallway before the door finished closing. June handed her the phone without speaking. The message was from Thomas Aldrin's office. 4 sentences. Mercer Capital. She caught herself. Aldrin Capital was withdrawing from all discussions regarding a gift commitment to Hartwell Children's Medical Center, effective immediately. The decision was final. Further communications should be directed to their legal representative. The final sentence read, "We wish Hartwell and its patients continued success." She read it twice. When did this come in? 10:41. June's voice was careful. 2 minutes before the break. 41 minutes since the meeting had started. 41 minutes since the man in the work boots had been walked to the lobby. "June," she said. "Yes, what does Thomas Aldrin look like?" June was quiet for a moment. Then she took back her phone, searched briefly, and handed it over. The photograph was simple. A middle-aged man, unremarkable background, the kind of professional headshot that conveyed nothing except that the person had sat still long enough for someone to take it. He was wearing a plain dark jacket. His expression was calm, unhurried. She handed the phone back. She stood in the hallway outside the room where 11 people were waiting for her, and the courtyard below was still there, and the mother with the child in the knit hat was probably still on that bench, and she said nothing for a moment. Then she said quietly, "I need 5 minutes." She went to the single-stall bathroom at the end of the hall. She ran cold water over her wrists, the way her mother had taught her as a teenager when the before-race anxiety got too big for her body. She stood at the sink and looked at herself in the mirror. She had spent 3 weeks preparing for today. She had made sure the right room was booked and the right slides were loaded and the right case studies were printed. And she had walked a man out of the meeting without asking his name. She dried her hands. She went back in and concluded the meeting with 3 sentences and thanked everyone for their time and let the room empty around her. Then she sat at the table in the silence and looked at Thomas Aldrin's empty chair and thought, with the specific clarity of someone who has already moved past the grief and arrived at inventory, what do I actually know? She dug the next morning. What she found on Thomas Aldrin was more and less than she expected. He had built Aldrin Capital from a small family office into one of the most respected philanthropic investment vehicles in the country. Not the biggest, not the most visible, but consistent and serious, and driven by a personal philosophy he rarely articulated publicly. He'd lost his wife when his daughter was 4. He'd raised the girl alone. The daughter, from what Cassandra could piece together from a single profile piece in a regional magazine from 3 years ago, was named Rosie, 8 years old now. She was described in one line as Thomas's reason for everything. Near the end of the profile, there was a quote. She read it twice. "I gave up a long time ago on being perceived as important. I'm interested in whether the work is real." Those two things are almost never the same conversation. Cassandra put the article down. She stood at her office window, arms crossed, looking at the courtyard below where the stone bench was empty this morning, and she thought about a man who had walked into a meeting alone with a vending machine coffee and let himself be shown the door. He'd been testing something. The question she was sitting with was what exactly, and whether the test had only one answer. She called Harriet at 2 in the afternoon. Harriet answered on the 3rd ring. "Miss Holt," she said. "Just that. Thank you for picking up." I considered not. A pause. "What happened yesterday was difficult to watch. I know. Do you?" Harriet's voice wasn't unkind. It was precise. From where I was sitting, the executive director of a hospital asking for $3 million didn't recognize the person she was asking it from, and when that person appeared without fanfare, she had him escorted to the lobby. Cassandra breathed. "That's accurate. He tests organizations this way," Harriet said after a moment. "He arrives without introduction. He wants to see how a room treats someone who doesn't look like money. A beat. Most rooms fail. Were we worse than most?" Harriet considered. "Your coordinator was following protocol. The people in the room followed his lead. That's culture, not individual character." Another pause. "But he was watching you, not Brett. He was watching you specifically to see what you'd do, and you turned back to the presentation." Cassandra was very still. "Is there anything I can do?" "I don't know," Harriet said. "He doesn't reopen closed decisions as a rule." A pause. "But he did ask me one question this morning." Cassandra waited. "He asked whether you made this call yourself or had your assistant do it." Cassandra looked at her phone, at her own name on the outgoing screen. "I called, I know," Harriet said. "I already told him that." 2 days later, Marcus came to her office and closed the door. Marcus only closed the door when the news was the kind that needed walls. He sat down and put a single sheet of paper on her desk, covered in his small, precise handwriting. He'd spent the previous evening going through the hospital's vendor records and board-authorized consulting arrangements. What he'd found was a thread, thin but real, connecting a recently approved strategic advisory contract worth substantially more than its documented scope to a holding entity called Westfield Consulting Partners. Westfield Consulting Partners, when traced through 2 intermediary filings, connected back to a financial management group whose listed contacts included their own board chair, Gerald Ashworth. He's been on the board for 9 years, Marcus said. I know. Cassandra looked at the paper. The Aldrin gift would have come in as restricted funds, ring-fenced for the oncology wing, but the advisory contract approved 3 months ago was structured to allow for what they called strategic realignment fees in the event of major gift restructuring. He paused. If the gift had closed and then been renegotiated, which Gerald has been quietly suggesting for weeks, the fee would have triggered. She looked up. He was going to let the deal close and then move to restructure it and collect the difference. Cassandra looked at the paper. She looked at it for a long time. How sure are you? I've been at this for 14 hours, Marcus said. I'm sure enough. The room was very quiet. Through her window, she could see the edge of the courtyard garden. A janitor was sweeping the path near the stone bench in slow, unhurried arcs. She watched him for a moment. Don't tell anyone, she said. Already haven't. She thought all night. At 7 the next morning, she was at the coffee cart on the first floor. The good one, near the main entrance, run by a man named Terrence, who had been there since before Cassandra had taken the director role and who made her coffee without being asked because she always ordered the same thing. She was at the window seat with her second cup and a legal pad when she became aware of a small person walking into the lobby with a frank assessment of someone who had opinions about rooms. The girl was maybe 8. She had dark curly hair and wore a yellow raincoat that was slightly too big for her. She carried a sketch pad pressed against her chest. She looked at the lobby mural with the running children and tilted her head. Then she walked to a bench near the window and sat down and opened the sketch pad and started drawing without looking up. Cassandra watched her for a moment. Then she looked back at her legal pad. 2 minutes later, the lobby doors opened. She knew before she turned. She couldn't have explained it. Call it pattern recognition, the way her brain had been running on high alert for 4 days, assembling a picture from fragments. Thomas Aldrin walked through the doors holding a paper cup, the good kind, from the cart she noticed, the large size, and crossed the lobby toward the bench where the girl was sitting. He said something low that made her look up briefly from the sketch pad, and then she looked back down, and he sat beside her and opened a folder. He didn't look at Cassandra. She looked at her legal pad for approximately 90 seconds, which was about 85 seconds longer than it took her to make the decision. She stood. She walked to where they were sitting. She stood there until he looked up. 4 seconds. When he did, his expression was the same one she'd seen across the conference room, unhurried, attentive, not unkind and not warm, the expression of a man who was simply present in whatever room he occupied and had no interest in performing otherwise. I owe you an apology, she said. She hadn't planned the words. They were just true. Not a professional apology, a real one. What happened in that room happened because I was paying attention to the wrong things, and you were the one who paid for it. He looked at her. The girl had stopped drawing. Her pencil rested on the page. You didn't have to make it easy for us, Cassandra said. You made it as easy as you could, and we still got it wrong. I'm sorry. Something moved through his expression. Not softness exactly. Something more complicated than that. The particular expression of a person who has prepared for a specific outcome and finds themselves, against their own expectations, uncertain. Sit down, he said. She sat. The girl looked up then. Dark eyes, steady and direct, the same quality of attention as her father's, except hers came with an 8-year-old's total absence of social filter. She studied Cassandra for a moment, then looked back at her sketch pad. This is Rosie, Thomas said. He said the name the way people say the names of things they would do anything to protect. Hi, Rosie. Rosie said nothing, but she turned the sketch pad slightly in Cassandra's direction. On the page was the lobby, the mural, the coffee cart, Terrence behind the counter, the bench, a partial figure of her father. The proportions were slightly off in the way that observational drawings were when the person drawing them cared more about capturing truth than achieving geometry. It was very good. She draws wherever we go, Thomas said. Not an apology, a fact. I can see that. Cassandra looked at the sketch. She thought about the right thing to say and decided the honest version was better. She's got a real eye. Rosie accepted this without comment, which felt like high praise. Cassandra looked at Thomas. I know what this hospital needs, she said, and I'm not here to pitch you. I'm here because something else is happening, something inside my organization, and I think you may have already suspected it, which is part of why you showed up the way you did. He watched her. Why are you telling me this? He said. Because you already left, she said. You have no obligation to be in this building, so if you tell me what you know, it's because it's true, not because it helps either of us. A long pause. The lobby moved around them. Someone at the coffee cart laughed. A family came through the main doors with a stroller and the particular controlled urgency of people who had been in this building enough times to know their way. Gerald Ashworth, Thomas said. The name landed. He reached out to us 8 weeks before your presentation, Thomas said. Indirectly, through an intermediary. He communicated that the gift would likely be restructured post-commitment, that there was flexibility in how restricted the funds could be. He represented that you were aware of and aligned with this approach. Thomas's voice was even. I arrived at your meeting to evaluate whether that was true. Cassandra was perfectly still, and then I was asked to wait in the lobby, he said. Not with satisfaction, just factual. I understand. I don't think you understand completely, he said. He leaned forward slightly, the first change in his posture. What Ashworth told us suggests he had already arranged for the gift to be restructured in a way that would benefit entities connected to him. The goal wasn't to close the deal. The goal was to use the closing as a mechanism. Cassandra looked at the legal pad in her hands, at the notes she'd been making since 5 a.m, at the thread Marcus had pulled, at the shape it was beginning to take. Can you prove it, she said. I can tell you what I know, he said. What you do with it is your work, not mine. I mean that. It has to be yours. She understood. The line was clear and it was right, and she respected it. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. Rosie looked up. She turned the sketchpad toward Cassandra. On the page now, added while they'd been talking in the same quiet, absorbed way she did everything, was the window seat. 2 figures, 2 coffee cups. The mural in the background just suggested, "Is that us?" Cassandra said. Rosie considered the drawing. You have the same face, she said. What face? The kind where you're thinking about something hard. Rosie looked at her father for confirmation. Dad has it at dinner sometimes. Thomas made a sound that was nearly a laugh. He converted it into clearing his throat, mostly unsuccessfully. Cassandra looked at the 2 small, careful figures on the page. She looked at the girl who had drawn them with the unself-conscious focus of someone who saw things clearly and put them down as they were. She felt something shift in the morning, not the crisis, which was still fully present, still heavy and real, but something underneath it, a current running a different direction. She stood. She picked up her legal pad. I have a lot of work to do, she said. I know, he said. She walked back across the lobby toward the elevator. She passed the mural on the north wall, the painted children running toward something out of frame, and pushed the button and thought about Thomas Aldrin's quiet voice saying it has to be yours, and about Rosie's drawing, and about Gerald Ashworth's name sitting in a room where it hadn't been said out loud yet. She got to work. What she had. Marcus's documentation of the advisory contract and its connection to Westfield. Thomas's account of the intermediary approach. The timeline. Gerald pushing for early commitment. Gerald suggesting restructuring flexibility. Gerald positioned to benefit from a shift in fund designation. What she needed. A paper chain that survived scrutiny. Something a lawyer couldn't walk backward in 20 minutes. The kind of pattern that didn't look like coincidence because it wasn't. She pulled every board-authorized contract from the past 4 years. She had Marcus run the vendor records. She had the hospital's legal counsel, a woman named Patricia Wren, who had been doing institutional law for 25 years, and who received complicated information the way a good surgeon received a difficult case, with interest rather than alarm. Review what they had so far. Patricia called her back in 40 minutes. Talk to me, Patricia said. Cassandra talked. She laid it out in the order she'd assembled it, not because she was performing clarity, but because she'd been building this in her head for 3 days, and the structure was now solid. When she finished, the line was quiet. How documented is the contract connection? Patricia asked. Marcus built it. It's documented the Thomas Aldrin account of the intermediary approach. Firsthand, verbal. Nothing in writing yet. Written would be stronger. I know. Patricia made a sound, not dismissive, the kind that meant she was organizing. Here's what I need. Don't approach Ashworth. Don't move anything off the hospital's systems, but make sure your CFO has separate copies held externally. Get me everything you have by Friday morning. A pause. If what you're describing holds up, this is a breach of fiduciary duty at minimum. Depending on the gift structure, potentially fraud. Fraud. The word sat in the air of her office for a moment. One more question, Patricia said. Who knows? Marcus. Me. The external donor, though not the details of what we've found, keep it exactly there. Every person you add is a variable outside your control. After she hung up, Cassandra sat at her desk and thought about Thomas in the lobby that morning, about the line he'd drawn. She thought about whether she could ask him for something written, a documented account, not testimony, just what he'd observed. She picked up her phone and composed a text. She kept it brief. She said she needed 15 minutes if he was willing. She said she wasn't asking him to carry any part of this. She said she'd explain. She put the phone face down. She lasted 4 minutes before it buzzed. Tomorrow, same lobby. 8 a.m. she exhaled. She went back to the documents. There was still more to find, and she knew it, and she was right. Gerald Howe was Hartwell's IT director. She'd gotten the name mixed with someone else for half a second and corrected herself. Gerald Ashworth was the board chair. The IT director was a quiet man named Dennis Chu, who had been at the hospital for 11 years and who sent her a message at 4:15 that afternoon saying he'd flagged some anomalies in the access logs for the internal grants database and would she like to review them. She wrote back, "Tomorrow, 7 a.m., my office. Tell no one." He wrote back one word, "Understood." The anomalies were in the records for the Restricted Gifts Projections database, the file system that held multi-year funding models, renovation cost estimates, and the sensitivity analyses the development team used when building major gift proposals. Someone had been accessing those files in careful, spaced intervals for the past 7 months. The access credentials belonged to a third-party strategic advisor whose board-authorized engagement had been championed and overseen by the board chair. She wrote the advisor's name down. She checked the time. It was 11:40. She drove home. She made tea and stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the middle distance and tried to get tired enough to sleep. She wasn't. She lay on her bed in her work clothes and looked at the ceiling and let the shape of what Gerald Ashworth had built come into focus the way a photograph came into focus in a dark room. Slowly, then all at once. He'd had access. He'd had trust. He'd had 9 years in that room and a way of making every suggestion sound like consensus. He'd watched the capital campaign struggle and had positioned himself to benefit from its failure, or more precisely, from its partial success followed by deliberate restructuring. He hadn't needed it to collapse. He'd needed it to almost succeed. She thought about all the small moments she'd taken at face value. The dinner 3 weeks ago, where he'd been so enthusiastic about the Aldrin approach. That enthusiasm, she now understood, had not been about the hospital. She fell asleep with the light on. She woke at 5:48 to her alarm, still dressed, mouth dry, and got up and started again. Thomas was at the lobby coffee cart when she arrived Thursday morning. He had Rosie's sketch pad tucked under his arm, which meant Rosie was somewhere, school, presumably, and he was carrying it for her. He looked at her face when she walked in. "How bad is it?" he said. 7 months of file access, she said. A structured advisory arrangement connected to outside entities. A pattern across 4 years of board decisions. She paused. "I have a lawyer. I have documentation. I need one thing I don't have yet." He was already nodding, slowly. He'd understood before she'd finished the sentence. "The intermediary's name," she said, "and what he communicated to you. Written. Not testimony, just what you observed." Thomas wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He looked at the mural on the north wall for a moment, the painted children running. "The intermediary's name is Dale Whitmore," he said. "He represents himself as a gift facilitation consultant. I've encountered him in connection with 2 other situations where a board insider used him to approach outside donors ahead of a formal process." He looked at her. "I can give you a written account of the approach, the date, and the substance of what was communicated. That's what I need. I'll have Harriet send it to your lawyer by end of day." He paused. "On one condition." She waited. "You're the one who presents this to the board," he said. "Not your lawyer, not Marcus. You walk into that room and you put it on the table yourself." She looked at him. She almost said, "Of course." She stopped herself because it wasn't of course, and they both knew it. Of course was what you said when a thing was easy. This was not going to be easy. "I know," she said instead. "I know it has to be me." He nodded. He picked up his coffee. They stood together for a moment in the lobby, the hospital waking up around them, the shift change beginning, the coffee cart filling with early arrivals, the mural keeping its quiet watch. "Thank you," she said. "Go do the work," he said. Not dismissive. Just true. The weekend was the hardest kind of waiting. She stayed out of the hospital on Saturday on purpose. She didn't trust herself not to keep pulling at threads she'd already pulled as far as they would go. She reorganized her closet instead, which was not rest, but was different from what her brain wanted to do. She reviewed her notes Sunday, not the documents, she'd internalized those. Just the notes in her own handwriting, the narrative she'd built across the past week, walking herself through the boardroom, the seats, the light, where Gerald would sit, what he would do when she started laying it down. He'd try to redirect. He'd use the warmth he'd spent 9 years building, the collegial tone, the elder statesman patience, and he'd aim it at the rest of the board like something that had never been a weapon. He'd suggest she was reactive, under pressure, misinterpreting coincidence as conspiracy. She ran every version of his response until she'd mapped them all. She went to bed at 10 and slept better than she had in 10 days. She was in the building by 6:30 Monday morning. June arrived at 7 and stopped in her office doorway and looked at her, the pressed clothes, the organized desk, the second coffee already in hand, and said, "Today, today," Cassandra said. June closed the door behind her. She stood across the desk. You want me in the room? I need you outside it. June understood what that meant without needing it spelled out. She made the notes. She handled the logistics. She told Gerald's assistant that the director had called an emergency board session under the charter's integrity disclosure provision. And she did it in the tone of someone conveying routine information, which was the only useful tone for this kind of morning. At 9:58, Cassandra took the elevator to 4 alone. She rode it in silence and let herself feel what she felt. Afraid, yes. Resolved, yes. Both at the same time, which was the only combination she'd ever trusted. The boardroom looked exactly as it always did. The oval table. The pale winter light through the glass. The courtyard below, the stone bench, the bare trees. She set her documents at her place. Not the seat she usually took, but the head which she'd claimed before anyone arrived. Patricia sat to her left, Marcus across from her. The room filled in over 8 minutes. 9 board members, the hospital's general counsel, the chair of the audit committee. Gerald arrived at 10:02. He was wearing the gray suit he wore for important meetings. He came in the way he always came in, making brief contact with each person, the warmth moving ahead of him through the room like something deployed. He looked at Cassandra at the head of the table. Something crossed his face, fast, controlled, and then the warmth came back. Cassandra, he said, taking his seat. Unusual setup for a Monday. Thank you for being here, she said. He looked at Patricia, at Marcus, at the bound documents in front of her. His eyes moved across the room with the practiced attention of a man who'd been reading rooms for decades. He decided to look relaxed. He was very good at it. She began. She did it the way Patricia had outlined. Timeline first, pattern before name. She walked the board through the access logs, the dates, the specific files that had been pulled and when. She presented the advisory contract structure, the fee trigger provisions, the downstream entities. She watched the board members' faces as the shape of it emerged. The audit committee chair leaning forward, the general counsel going very still in the particular way. Lawyers went still when they understood what they were looking at. She did not look at Gerald, not yet. She presented the Westfield connection. She walked through 2 previous board decisions that had followed a pattern, vendor approvals, consulting endorsements, that served connected entities rather than the hospital's interests. She laid it down neutrally, without adjectives, and let the documentation carry the weight. She heard Gerald shift in his chair. She presented the Aldrin approach last. She introduced it as a written account from an external donor. She did not say Thomas's name, describing the intermediary contact that had preceded the formal meeting, the terms that had been communicated, and the specific ways those terms differed from any proposal she or her development team had ever authorized. She set the document down. She looked up at the room. The audit committee chair was looking at Gerald. So were 2 of the independent trustees. The general counsel had stopped writing. Gerald looked at Cassandra. Patricia had told her this moment would come. She'd said, "He's going to look at you in a way that's meant to make you feel like the problem in the room. He's done it before." She'd asked what people usually did. "Most of them look away," Patricia had said. Gerald looked at her. The full warmth of 9 years, trained on her like something she'd always thought was collegial, and now saw plainly for what it was. She looked back. She did not look away. "These are serious concerns," Gerald said. His voice was smooth, modulated, the voice of a man who'd been managing rooms his entire career. "And I want to be clear that I take them seriously. But I think what we have here is a series of circumstantial connections, presented by a director who is understandably under considerable pressure following a difficult week, and what we owe this institution. Under Section 11 of the board charter," Cassandra said, without raising her voice, "an integrity disclosure by the executive director may not be interrupted by motion until the presentation is complete." She looked at him directly. "I'll ask you to hold your response until I'm done." She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked back at the room and continued. When she finished, the silence that followed had shape, the kind that gathered in a room after something true had been said that couldn't be unsaid. Gerald put both hands on the table. "I've given 9 years to this institution," he said. 9 years, and I think this board knows. I think we've heard the disclosure." The voice came from the far end of the table. A woman named Eugenia Cross, the longest-tenured independent trustee who had been on the board since before Cassandra was in this role, who rarely spoke first, and whose voice, when it came, tended to settle things. She was looking at Gerald with an expression that was not angry, but was entirely without warmth. "I think we should vote." Something collapsed in Gerald's face. Not dramatically. There was no single visible moment of defeat. It was more like watching a structure develop a crack. Still standing, still trying to look load-bearing, but something fundamentally different about it. The vote took 6 minutes. The motion to authorize an independent audit passed. The motion for Gerald's immediate recusal pending the audit passed. The one vote against both was Gerald's own. He cast it looking straight ahead, jaw tight, the warmth entirely gone from his face now, replaced by something smaller and harder that she'd never seen before and recognized immediately. The expression of a man watching something he'd built quietly for years come apart in front of the person he'd underestimated most. He stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Cassandra. "You're making a mistake," he said, quietly, without the warmth. "I don't think I am," she said. He left. The door closed. Eugenia Cross caught Cassandra's eye from across the table. She gave her one slow nod, the kind that carried more than a sentence would. Cassandra nodded back. She stood at the head of the table until the room had mostly cleared. Then she sat down and put both hands flat on the table and breathed, because her knees were doing something she didn't want on display. Patricia sat back down across from her. "You held the room," Patricia said. "I held the room," Cassandra said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. After Patricia left, Marcus stayed. He looked at her with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying something heavy alongside another person and had just finally set it down. "Your father would have done it the same way," he said. He wasn't a man who said things like that casually. She knew what it cost him to say it, and she accepted it. "Thank you," she said, "for bringing this to me and not somewhere else." "It's your hospital," he said simply, and he left. She sat in the empty boardroom for a long time. She looked at the courtyard below, the stone bench, the bare trees, the particular quality of the November light, the way it came through the glass in a long bright stripe across the table. She watched the stripe move. Her phone buzzed. She picked it up and typed a message to Thomas. She kept it brief. The board voted. Audit authorized. He's out. She looked at it for a moment, then added, "I held the room." She sent it. She put the phone down and looked at the city through the glass. It buzzed, 3 words back. "I know you did." She looked at the message. She thought about how he could know that. She thought he didn't, not factually. The vote had just happened. She thought it was something else. The confidence of someone who had watched another person carefully and was not surprised by what they'd done. The particular confidence of someone who had seen her clearly before she'd seen herself. She put the phone in her pocket. She picked up her bag. She had a hospital to run and 380 people who would need to hear from her before they read any of it somewhere else. She had the work of rebuilding to begin, which was different from the work of survival. Slower, less legible from the outside, but more durable. She was beginning to understand more than she'd walked in with. She took the elevator down to the lobby. She passed the mural, the painted children running towards something out of frame, and she paused in front of it the way she almost never let herself pause, and she looked at it. At the color of it, the movement, the sense of going toward rather than away. Then she walked through the lobby and out through the main doors into the November cold, and she kept going. 3 weeks later, Rosie Aldrin finished a drawing she'd been working on since the morning in the lobby. She showed it to Cassandra on a Saturday when the 3 of them met at a diner 2 blocks from the hospital, Rosie's choice, for reasons that had to do with the specific quality of their French toast. The drawing was the lobby, the mural on the north wall, the coffee cart, Terence behind the counter. And in the foreground, in more detail than anything else, 2 figures at the window bench, 2 cups, one of them serious-faced. One of them, Rosie pointed at it without self-consciousness, slightly less. "That's you," she told Cassandra, pointing at the less serious figure, "from the second time. The first time you had more of this." She pressed her lips together into a line and squinted slightly, a surprisingly accurate impression. Cassandra looked at Thomas, who had the expression of a parent watching a child be completely accurate about something he'd been diplomatically quiet on. "Fair," Cassandra said. Rosie accepted this and went back to her French toast. Thomas looked at her across the table. The diner was warm and loud and imperfect in all the ways that real things were imperfect. The light was bad. Someone at the counter was laughing too loudly. Outside, the city moved the way the city always moved, enormous and indifferent and continuous. "The proposal," he said. Not a question. She told him it was almost ready. 2 more weeks, she said. "I want it to be right, not fast." "It'll be right," he said. She looked at him. "You haven't read it." "No," he said. "But I've watched how you build things." Rosie looked up from her plate. She studied them both with the direct, unhurried gaze that Cassandra had come to understand was simply how Rosie looked at things she was about to draw. "You're staying, right?" Rosie said. She said it to Cassandra, not to her father. "Staying where?" Rosie gestured vaguely with her fork. "Here, around, you know?" Cassandra looked at the girl. At the sketch pad beside her plate, at the drawing she'd been carrying for 3 weeks, at the small, careful figures rendered in pencil with a clarity that an 8-year-old had no right to have and possess completely. Yes, Cassandra said. I'm staying. Rosie nodded, satisfied, and returned to her French toast. Thomas picked up his coffee. Outside, the November street went about its life. And Cassandra held what she'd built, the audit, the reformed board, the hospital standing on the other side of the worst thing that had happened to it, the capital campaign resuming on honest terms, the oncology wing that would now actually get built, and she held something else alongside it. Quieter and harder to name, something she'd almost convinced herself she wasn't going to get to have. She held it carefully. It felt like the beginning of the part where the damage started to matter less than what came after.